being killed. They gave them the overdoses of drugs. They were the ones who put them out on the verandas to die of hypothermia. The nurses were the ones who withheld the feeding so the children would die of starvation.
After World War I ended in 1918, Germany went through severe economic hardships, and the nation saw the rise of different political factions and ideals. One group that emerged was Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party.
Of course, there was rampant inflation, there was great poverty and social disadvantage because of the reparations which had to be paid back after the Treaty of Versailles.
Money was devalued, and they saw a strong leader that was restoring order.
By 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had taken control of Germany, and this began a period of racial hygiene laws, persecution, and death camps. Hitler wanted to create the master race and eliminate Jews and other people he considered inferior to the Aryan race. Innocent children and concentration camp prisoners suffered through horrific medical experiments. All of this was accomplished with the assistance of German doctors and nurses. The basis for Hitler's plan of racial hygiene was a concept called eugenics, which is the pseudoscience of developing a superior race.
Before Hitler came to power, across the world, the whole theory of eugenics was something that many nations had embraced.
Eugenics is the belief that through selective breeding, whether it's cows, sheep, people, whatever, through selective breeding, positive eugenics is the ability to breed offspring that will carry the best traits.
This theory of eugenics, how people should be allowed to breed to the benefit of the human race, and those who weren't fit and healthy should not be allowed to have children.
Caught on in England, the United States, Japan, Scandinavia. Germany was not at the forefront of this.
And the Nazis actually learned much of their eugenics initially from the U.S.
Some of these eugenic healthcare policies were developed in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These U.S. policies were emulated by Germany and incorporated into the governing philosophy of applied biology.
There were laws on the book in Virginia that said that you could sterilize people, and the Nazis took their 1933 sterilization law and mimicked it after the U.S. law. Yeah, in fact, there was a time in which there were letters in the U.S. journals saying, look, the Nazis have gotten ahead of us. We've got to catch up.
And so, of course, when Hitler came along with his racial theories, he realised that this eugenics was a really good idea, and he manipulated it to fit his racial theories, all mixed in with the Jews, the Gypsies, everybody else who was considered racially inferior.
All of this would lead to an appalling era in world history called the Holocaust, a period of persecution and mass murder.
The Holocaust has been defined as the 12-year period from Hitler's rise to power in 1933 until the end of the war, 1945. It was a government-planned, government-supported mass extermination or mass killing, and while it was targeted towards Jewish people, there were many other groups of individuals that suffered during the Holocaust.
Hitler convinced the German people that the Jews were their enemy and the cause of their problems. He then created an atmosphere of racial intolerance and hatred of people deemed to be racially inferior.
So every genocide, whether it's Rwanda, the Holocaust, begins with we versus them. So Hitler used the Jews and later other people as scapegoats for all that was wrong in Germany, particularly the economic woes. So he set up the we versus them. He institutionalized them.
In 1933, the Nazi government passed the Nuremberg Laws for the protection of hereditary health. This legalized involuntary sterilization.
So Hitler found a perfect meshing of his Nazi ideology with the eugenic Nazi medicine or racial hygiene movement.
Germany's sterilization laws led to the involuntary sterilization by doctors of about 400,000 Germans. Nazi doctors sterilized citizens against their will, euthanized 200,000 disabled German children and adults, and created the gas chambers and crematoria that were used for the mass murder of 6 million Jews, Poles, and Gypsies. Without the full support of physicians, scientists, and nurses, the Holocaust, as it unfolded, could never have happened.
In the U.S., there were laws that could require that people be sterilized against their will.
Sterilization laws were widespread in the U.S., most notably in Indiana and North Carolina. But other states, including California and Virginia, allowed sterilization even into the 1970s. In fact, in the early 20th century, the U.S. led the world in compulsory sterilizations.
A very famous law was passed in Virginia that said it was okay to sterilize the retarded. And it was brought before the Supreme Court, and Oliver Wendell Holmes said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, saying that it was okay to sterilize.
But it didn't go further. While in Germany it became the leading ideology, then it was implemented into action.
Hitler promised the German people they were creating the master race.
I think the master race would have been the Nazis' view of a strong, blonde, blue-eyed, healthy person who had no genetic defects and who was pure Aryan.
In the 1920s and 30s, Germany's medical community was considered the best in the world.
You weren't a real doctor in the U.S. unless you went to Germany to study, and then you came back and said, I studied in Germany.
I think with that came some arrogance and some feeling that we are so superior to everybody else. I studied medicine in Germany. I know some of the best teaching of anatomy, physiology, and medicine came from Germany. Germany was very advanced, not only in the medical field, but Germany was the best civilization among the European countries.
It was the height of technology, the height of science. How was it possible that these people became murderers?
The majority of nurses were not members of the Nazi Party. However, to have a job in Germany, a nurse had to belong to one of several nursing organizations. There were 5 organizations for nurses. Among these, the National Socialist Nurses and the Red Cross Nurses swore an oath of allegiance to Hitler. Additionally, the Protestant Nurses Organization said that it greets National Socialism with an open heart.
Surprisingly, more physicians, percentage-wise, joined the Nazi Party than the population in general. And I think physicians were very taken with the fact that we can use our science to improve the human race.
Many physicians and nurses enthusiastically supported the Nazi regime and were involved in all aspects of the Holocaust.
About 40% of German physicians were in the Nazi Party, while the lawyers and teachers and the other white-collar professions joined in much lesser numbers. If you didn't join the Nazi Party, there was no retribution.
Using inflammatory propaganda, Hitler and the Nazis began a campaign against the Jews.
And I know that my father used to say that bad things are happening to Jewish people in Germany. They're being discriminated against. Jewish children can no longer go to their regular school. People cannot keep their jobs at the university or other professions. Hitler said, follow me, never mind God, never mind religion. Just follow me, do what I am asking you to do.
And since the regime was totalitarian, and they were very good at public campaigns and propaganda, and they had enough scientists and physicians that were already marching to the drum.
Propaganda is an extremely powerful way to convince people to their way of thinking.
Germany's medical establishment began to support the Nazi Party, except for Jewish doctors, who were ostracized.
The official journal of the German Medical Association started to have a swastika on their journal, and they got rid of all the Jewish physicians, authors, people in office of all the different associations and societies very quickly. And in 5 or 6 years, they got them out of all the academic and professional establishment.
After years of strong Nazi propaganda, Germany's doctors and nurses began to accept the belief that racial hygiene would be good for the nation.
Social Darwinism said we need to eliminate these inferior people that were handicapped, that were maybe mentally disturbed. We want a healthy, thriving society.
In Germany, the proponents of the eugenic movement were the most prominent, the most powerful, the establishment. The legal system became Nazified immediately.
Well, of course, it required lawyers, it required doctors, it required bureaucrats, it required administrators, but many of the nurses were the ones who actually carried out the injections. But for a long time, nurses were the agents of the physicians, and the physicians in the Nazi period were agents of the state. So that's very important, because physicians were no longer asked to care for patients, but to care for the state, the folk, the German folk. And so what was good for the state was what was important, not what was good for an individual patient.
Obedience was still very much a part of the way nurses were taught and the way we thought. So it's not surprising that the nurses in the Nazi era got caught up in all this.
Euthanasia programs were established in Nazi Germany in which children and adults were killed if they were considered unfit for life and were a burden on the state. The true meaning of euthanasia would be the mercy killing of a person with their permission or their request. However, this was not the case in Nazi Germany. These killings were without consent. They were murders. In the 1920s, German lawyer Karl Binding and German psychiatrist Alfred Hoche co-authored the book The Permission to Destroy Life Unworthy of Life. This book greatly influenced Hitler's thinking about euthanasia.
Everybody had that propaganda thrown at them. It was common. It was everywhere, and it espoused the idea that people who were in some way deficient should be killed, so that they didn't carry on the defective genes, and so that they weren't a burden on the state. So the nurses, just as everybody else in society, were susceptible to this. The nurses were working in hospitals where children with disabilities, people with mental illnesses, a whole range of conditions were cared for. They weren't coerced into becoming part of these programs.
Once you accept humans can be humanized, eventually you can engage in exterminating it. And this was a gradual and very powerful and unfortunately very effective process that took place in Germany.
The Nazi euthanasia program first started in 1939 as a means to eliminate handicapped children.